Well, I think I'll just get started and leave this as a VOD. For other people who have not been able to join from the start, you are welcome to start listening in now. As we begin our tale of The Phoenix Unchained, Book 1 of the Enduring Flame. Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. I'll be pausing in and throughout the entirety of it to take a drink of water as needed. So let me go ahead and turn down this music and eventually. Hopefully that's still audible. There we go. Chapter 1. The Flower Festival. It was Festival Sennight in Amarthalie, and even though spring was sennights away, the entire city was garlanded in flowers of every kind. The city's greenhouses were always kept busy for moon turns in anticipation of the demand, for what was the anniversary of the great flowering without flowers? Though the city streets were still crusted with the remains of late snow, it was barely kindling, and the flowers only the flowers to be seen in the natural world were snowdrops and a few hardy early daffodils. Every house on the street was garlanded in evergreen swags and bright glass and metal flowers. Even the lampposts had been decorated. Indoors, where it was warmer, every home's light shrine was filled with flowers dedicated to the blessed Saint Idalia and her brother Kellen, the poor orphan boy, who had broken the power of the Undarkened over 10 centuries before. When he had been a baby, Harrier Gillian had been sure that sticking pages. This celebration was entirely for him. After all, he'd been born during the festival Sennight, and his naming day was the first day of the festival. His 3 older brothers had been happy to contribute to his confusion for as long as possible, assuring him that yes, indeed, the citywide celebration was entirely for him, and certainly it all meant he would grow up to be the great wild mage, perhaps even a night mage, like Kellen, the poor orphan boy. Even as a baby, Harrier had found that hard to believe. Everyone knew that night mages belonged to the time of legend. You might as well hope to see a dragon or an elf. And while everyone knew that they were both as real as wild mages, it was also true that they'd withdrawn to the lands far to the east, only a century or 2 after the Great Flowering. Harrier had more of a chance of meeting a wild mage, and he had about as much of a chance of that as he had of becoming the chief magistrate of Amarthalie, highest of the 9. But that was something he'd actually stopped thinking about a very long time ago. These days, Harrier knew exactly how his future would go. Once he'd finished his schooling, he would do exactly as his father had done, and his father, and for more generations than Harrier could count. He would do just as his brothers had already done and go to work for their father and Terence Gillian, the harbour master of Amarthalie. His eldest brother, Eugene, had worked in the customs house. His second eldest brother, Carlot, was apprenticed to a captain who compiled a packet, one of which and Terence Gillian owned shares, between the harbour and the out islands. Someday Carlot vowed he would earn his sea mastery and captain a deep voyager to the Selkin lands at the far side of the great ocean. And then there was Brelt. Harrier sighed. Brelt was nearly 23 years older than Harrier, and the Gillians had thought that he would be their last child. Everything would have worked out very well if he had been, for that would have meant one for the sea, one for the land, in this case the customs house, and the youngest would follow his father's footsteps and be trained to assume his position, as was the tradition of the Gillian family. Bralt Gillian absolutely loved everything to do with the work of being a harbor master. The details, the diplomacy, the need to have the customs and rules not only of the Armatheli the Golden, but of every land she traded with, constantly at the forefront of his mind. But then Harrier had been born. And later this year, when Harrier graduated Armatheli Normal School, he would come to work as an apprentice harbor master, and Bralt would move over to the customs house to begin apprenticeship under Eugene's. It really didn't seem fair. But as Bralt had told Harrier cheerfully, Harrier was even less suited to the customs house than he was to be an apprentice harbor master. Bralt assured them he would be happy enough in the customs house. Much of the work was similar, of course. Harrier knew Bralt was right, and both of them loved the port and the docks. They'd grown up there, having been brought to work by their father from the time either of them could walk. It was just that Harrier knew deep down inside that Bralt had the potential to be a far better harbor master than he would ever be. Bralt was glib and diplomatic, and always knew the right thing to say. Harrier? Well, even Harrier's best friends called him stubborn. But Dahl was a good man, and a smart man. He'll do what's best for the city. If I am a hopeless apprentice, why, he'll see that. He'll have Bralt back out of the customs house so fast it'll steal the wind from the sails of every ship out here to the outlands. And then... what then? Harrier certainly couldn't take Bralt's place in the customs house. Well, Dahl will think of something. And today's too fine a day to worry about something that's moon turns and moon turns away. Not with a whole sennight of holiday from lessons and me with a day of liberty from chores. In fact, Harrier not only had a day of liberty, he had a day of exile, since he had strictly been banished from his own home, forbidden to return before even sawing bells. His mother had assured him that the preparations for his naming day party would proceed much more smoothly in his absence. And so, as he often did, Harrier went seeking his best friend to share his rare day of freedom with. Harrier's household rose at first dawn bells, even though his father as portmaster was one of the most important men in the city, and Terence Gillian's family still kept tradesmen's hours. Harrier knew that, in contrast to his family's habits, most of the rest of the city, especially the nobility, preferred to lie in bed and miss the best part of the day. But even though the Rolforts were members of the nobility, minor nobility, Terciel always corrected him whenever he mentioned it, the Rolfort household stirred to wakefulness only a bell after the Harriers did. For even during festival sennight, when the port was quiet and many of the shops were closed, the administration of the city must go on. As he headed to the direction of the Rolfort townhouse, only 2 bells after his own awakening, Harrier was confident he would not only find them all awake, but that Lord Rolfort would have already departed for the day to his duties in the Chief Magistrate Volnel's office. When Harrier reached his destination, he took a moment to admire the festival sennight decorations that beckoned the front of Rolford's townhouse before entering the small, neat courtyard. The great stone unicorns at the gates had been garlanded with evergreen wreaths studded with the traditional glass flowers. His nurse used to tell him wonder tales about the time of mages, when all the statue and Armithili were alive and could walk and talk. It was a pretty story, though he'd long since outgrown wonder tales. He didn't believe it anyway. Not even a wild mage could bring a stone to life. But the stone unicorns with their garlands were pretty enough. In the little courtyard between the unicorns and the front door, tall evergreen and pots had been brought from the back garden and arranged in front of the pillars. Each one had been carefully garlanded with brilliant, glittering swags of tinsel. Harrier recognized Hivandi's work. The eldest of the Terciel's 4 sisters was always the one who took charge of the festival sennight decorations. Under her direction, the little courtyard of the Rolfort townhouse had been turned into a spring forest in full magical bloom. Over the door of the house itself, a representation of the eternal light had been hung, its golden rays sparkling in the early morning sun. More garlands of green framed the door itself, and, as a final touch, an enormous wreath was attached to the door, the evergreen interwoven with sweet-scented herbs and bright berries. With only a little difficulty, Harrier located the door knocker in the midst of it, a large brass object in the shape of a cheerful, fat-bellied fawn, and knocked loudly. "I knew it would be you," Dorices said, opening the door. She was the second youngest of the Tercel sisters, claiming the door duty today because, like most of the noble households of the city, the Roforts had been giving their servants the day off. "You spend more time here than your own home." Harrier didn't bother to dignify the gib with a response. Instead, he focused his attention on the squirming bundle in her arms. "And how is the man of the house today?" he teased. "You hold him," Dorices says promptly, depositing the baby Priadan unceremoniously into Harrier's arms and walking off. There was a moment of chaos while Harrier juggled his giggling, kicking burden. Fortunately, he was an uncle already several times over, and not in the least afraid of babies, before settling his unexpected charge securely in the crook of his arm and kicking the door shut with a backward jab of his boot. Priadan's birth, just over a bit of a year ago, had come as a great surprise to the Roforts. After the Brodana's birth, the healers had told Lady Rofort that there would be no more children, and that had been 8 years ago. With 5 children, and 4 of them girls, the Rofort family had seemed entirely complete. Priadan had come as a complete surprise to everyone. But a good surprise, as Terciel, the eldest, insisted. It gave his youngest sister something to fuss over. And, as he told Harrier, he no longer had to worry about being the only one to carry the Rofort family name. Though, as Priadan was only a little over a year old, it would be quite some time before they could expect much from him. With the baby in his arm, Harrier followed the familiar path to the breakfast room. The family was still gathered around the table, Lady Rolfort, her 4 daughters, ranging in age from 14 to 8, and all completely beneath Harrier's notice, and their elder brother, Terciel. Theirs might have seemed like an unlikely friendship. Harrier was a sturdy, bluff son of the harbour-master of Armathilai. Terciel was the son of a member of the minor nobility, destined, as generations of his family before him had been, for a secretaryship on an administrative council as soon as he had been completed his school. But the boys had been inseparable since the day they had met. It was one of Harrier's first vivid memories. He'd been 3 years old. The day was bright and warm. Harrier Gillian sat outside of Daw's office, watching the sun sparkle in the water of Armathilai Harbor. He was filled with pride that his Da trusted him to play out here all by himself, and not go wandering off. But he knew perfectly well that the docks were a dangerous place for little boys, and Da had told him exactly where to stay. He concentrated on his wooden ships, racing them against each other over the wooden planks. Suddenly his eyes caught a flash of movement. A little boy had come running out the back door of the harbour-master's office, and he was running down the wharf toward the water just as fast as he could go. "Hey!" The little boy didn't stop. He ran all the way to the end of the wharf, and Harry was sure a grown-up would appear, but no one did. That was wrong. He wasn't allowed on the wharf at all unless Carol or Eugene's or a grown-up was with them. "Hey!" he yelled again, setting down his wooden ship and getting to his feet. What should he do? There didn't seem to be any grown-ups around, and the little boy with white hair was teetering on the edge of the wharf. In another minute, he'd fall into the water, while Harrier didn't quite believe his brother's tales of wading sea monsters lurking in the water. He certainly believed his Da's stern warnings that little boy must not on any account go down to the edge of the wharf. He got to his feet and ran toward the other boy. He reached the end of the planks just about the time the stranger had decided to lie down on his stomach and squirm out as far as he could in order to see what he could see. And then wriggle out just a little farther, and a little farther still, and just as he was slipping into the water, Harrier managed to grab his ankle, and hold on just long enough for his Da and the boy's nurse to get there. And that was how Harrier Gillian met Tercel Rolfort. It was the first time he'd saved the younger boy from trouble, but not the last. For Tercel possessed an unbiting curiosity about, well, everything, as well as a conviction that nothing could possibly go wrong during his explorations, a conviction that Harrier had disproven more than once down through the intervening years. Harrier! Tercel looked up as he entered the room, blue eyes glinting with amusement. Is it even-sung bells already? Come to escort us to your naming day party? Cast out of my own home so they could prepare for it in peace, as you know perfectly well. Harrier answered chiefly. So I thought I'd come and bother you instead. You know you're always welcome here, Lady Rolfort said kindly from her place at the head of the table. Especially as you're so good as to take over those duties that Doreces seems to feel are too much for her. Mama, Doreces protested. He asked to hold the baby. Lady Rolfort simply held out her arms, and Harrier crossed the room, deposited Pruden in them. The toddler promptly squirmed to get down from his mother's lap, taking an unsteady step before sitting down with a thump on the gently worn carpet. Thank you, Gentledy, Harrier said politely. Have some tea, Har, Tercel said, and I'm sure you wouldn't mind another breakfast. Harrier grinned. There were some advantages to visiting a noble household. Breakfast in his own home had been almost 2 bells ago, and he had no objection at all to another one. He collected a clean plate and a cup from the sideboard, helping himself from a wide variety of dishes laid out upon the sideboard, before seating himself beside Tercel. As he ate, he made polite conversation with Lady Rolford, assuring her that his mother looked forward to seeing them all this evening at the party, which was certainly true, and telling her anything he knew of the port gossip that he thought might interest her. You begin your apprenticeship this summer, don't you? Lady Rolford asked. Yes, Gentledy. As soon as I graduate from the normal, of course. Tyr has a much grander future before him. Tercel kicked him under the table. Lady Rolfort smiled. University. You really must choose a course of study, Tercel. You shouldn't leave it all to the last minute. Tercel ducked his head. No, Mama, I promise. I'll choose something soon. Lady Rolfort laughed. He has been saying that for the past year, of course. But I'm certain whatever you choose, it will be perfectly suitable. And now, since I'm also certain that Harrier did not come here to spend the day indoors with you, why don't the 2 of you run along? Just be certain to be back here no later than the 2nd afternoon bells, so you have plenty of time to wash and dress for the evening. Are you sure, Mama? Tercel said, gesturing to his sisters. I am quite certain that I can keep 4 girls occupied for the day, Lady Rolfort said firmly. And if I don't decide to sell them to the silken traders, I might even take them to see the festival fair later. The squeals of, "Oh, Mama," and "Yes, please," were quite loud and shrill enough to make Harrier want to cover his ears, and to be so grateful that his nieces were not old enough to be quite so enthusiastic. The 2 boys stood out in the courtyard of the Rolford townhouse. But despite a pocket jingling with silver unicorns and copper demesnes, more money than most boys his age saw in a moon turn, Tercel's mood was somber. I don't see why Mama is so convinced I will somehow figure out what it is I want to study at Armatheli University between now and Harvest Moon turn, Tercel said, sounding uncharacteristically glum. Well, it hardly matters what you study, does it not? Harrier answered bluntly. It's not as if they teach you anything practical at university. Why does everything have to be practical with you? His friend retorted. See how far you get when things aren't. I like things I can see, hear, feel, and touch, Harrier said firmly. You always have, Tercel responded with a smile. So, we have time and money. Where shall we go? The harbor? Harrier suggested, as the 2 friends walked off down the street. If the city was grandly decorated for festival, then the port was even more grandly decorated, for it was there, according to the legend, that the unicorns had run across the water to save the city. Every ship in port flew a unicorn pennant at festival time and competed to see which ship could produce the most elaborate unicorn decoration upon its bow. We always go to the harbor, Tercel said dismissively. We could go to the Temple Square. The Great Library? Boring, Harrier sing-song. And you always go to the library. The university? The grounds are decorated for the festival, Tercel suggested. Harrier took a deep breath and huffed it out in a snort of exasperation. You'll see it soon enough come autumn, won't you? I suppose, Tercel agreed. It had been 3 years since the two boys had attended the same school. Those bound for university transferred to the preparatory school at 13 to spend 3 years there before entering university at 16. Those who were going to apprenticeship stayed at the normal school until the end of the school year in their 17th year, and then signed articles with a master in their field. As they argued amiably all over the places they could go, their steps took them from the streets of the noble quarter into the tradesmen's district, which bordered it. Here the streets were busier, even on the first day of the festival. Suddenly a shower of snow rained down from above. Harrier, who had gotten most of it down his collar, hopped and swore, looking around for his attacker. Tercel danced out of reach of his frantic lashings, laughing and pointing upward. Harry looked at the indicated direction. On a second-floor ledge, an industrious brownie housewife was sweeping away at the snow with a tiny broom. Tercel waved up at her, and the little creature paused in her labors to wave back before continuing to sweep the ledge free of snow. Brownies were one of the few other folk races who had elected to remain among humans when most of the other folk, at least the ones that people could see, had gone eastward with the elves. Their lives were always a mirror of the humans so closely resembled, and it was said to have a brownie family living in the walls of one's household brought luck. Both the Rolforts and the Gillians had had brownie families, perhaps even the same set of brownies, living with them as far back as their family records stretched. She could have picked a better time, Harrier grumbled, still shaking himself free of snow and skipping back to dodge a fresh shower of it. It's festival. Nobody works on festival. Brownies do, Tercel said unarguably. He stepped out into the street, motioning for Harry to follow. Did you know that there didn't used to be brownies in Amerthale? Harry snorted. I suppose that next you'll be telling me that there didn't used to be centaurs in Amerthale, he said, grabbing the collar of Tercel's cloak and hauling him back to the walkway, out of the path of a troop of centaurs who were trotting up the street in the other direction. This particular troop had undoubtedly become for the festival fair. By the end of the night, the city would be jammed with visitors from all 9 cities, and there wouldn't be a bed to be had in a hostel from here to Nirrendale. Well, every city had its own festival. The one in Armethalae was the oldest and best. By unspoken consent, the boys were heading towards the main garden park at the center of the city. The festival fair would already be underway there. Singers and dancers and storytellers, games of skill and chance, and, later in the day, a dozen different retellings of the events that festival celebrated, enacted by live actors, carved puppets, and even trained dogs. Festival fair had something for every taste. Do you suppose it'll all happen the way it did in the Wonder Tales? Tercel asked idly as they walked, with the dragons and the unicorns and the elves. It was the same question Tercel had asked, in one form or another, every festival fair for as long as Harrier had known him, and every year Harrier gave him pretty much the same answer. Well, Harrier said, the wild mages did say that it did. The elves came to rescue and helped us destroy the Underdark forever. And when they all went away to live far, far away, not the wild mages, of course, just the rest of them. He was never quite sure whether Tercel forgot the answer from year to year, or it just didn't satisfy him. Oh, yes, I saw a wild mage once. At least Ma did. She took me to Centarshden when I was a baby, and so sick that the healers couldn't do anything for me. There was a wild mage there, and he did actual magic and healed me. You never get tired of telling that story. Well, it happened. And your point? Just that I'm wondering that the rest of it is true. About Germian, Dragon Rider, and Kellen the poor orphan boy who came a night mage, and the Silver Eagle that got turned into a woman and became the blessed Saint Idalia and killed the Queen of the Andarken. That stuff. How should I know? You're the one who's always got his head stuck in a musty old book. Anyway, it happened about 1,000,000 years ago. Well, if the priests in the temple are right, it happened 1,008 years ago this night. Too much information, Ter. Maybe Tercel ought to become the next Harbour Master, Harrier mused. Because anybody who can remember all the things that Ter was always telling him about could certainly remember the catalog of ships in port and the custom regulations, too. Of course, that didn't mean that Harrier wanted to spend the rest of his life doing what Terso was going to be doing when he graduated university in 4 years, even if they'd been smart enough to get to university in the first place. No, he liked his life just the way it was. More or less. Tersail Rolfork regarded his friend with an indulgent expression, doing his best not to grin. He loved teasing Harrier. He just wished sometimes that Harrier would stop pretending he was dumb, because Tersail knew perfectly well that Harrier wasn't. He was going to be Harbor Master someday, and the Harbor Master was the second most important in Amarthalai. Tersail's father had said over and over, stupid men might gain power, but they never hold it. Harrier's family had been Harbor Masters in Amarthalai for centuries, and not only had the post been passed down in the family in an unbroken line, but the city had prospered. In a way, though he'd never say something like that to Harrier, of course, Tersail envied his friend. Harrier had always known exactly what his future would hold, and he'd always seemed happy with it. He loved the port and the docks. He was prepared for his future. Tersail had no idea what he wanted to do with his life. He knew that he knew what he was going to do with his life, of course. He was going to university. Harrier was right about one thing. It really didn't matter what Tersail studied there. It wasn't like an apprenticeship preparing him for his future trade. It was just to lend him polish and sophistication and culture, so that when he joined the ranks of other minor nobles and high-ranking trade-born who had served in the secretaryships and clerkships and consular posts that did the work that kept the city running, he would be among friends. Friends who shared his interests. Only he didn't think that was going to happen. It wasn't like Tersail Rolfort was a shunned outcast. People liked him. He made friends quickly and easily. Only not close friends. He liked helping people, and he liked solving problems, and over the years, those around him had naturally developed the habit of coming to them with their problems. But once the problem was solved, they sort of drifted away again. All but Harrier. Tersail shrugged inwardly. From the moment they'd met, the two boys had been allies. It didn't matter what harebrained scheme it was. Harrier's plan to sail a small boat out to the islands, Tersail's plan to explore the city sewers to discover evidence of the city's ancient past. Each had willingly fallen into the other's plans. There could not have been two boys more unalike in every way. Tersail slender, blonde, blue-eyed, and fair, and Harrier ruddied and red-headed and stocky, with eyes that went from brown to green depending on his mood. When they were entirely green, Tersail had long since learned, it was best to be quiet and careful around his friend, for Harrier was capable of losing his temper completely, and when he did, it was a very bad thing for all concerned. But their friendship seemed to be built on as much as their differences as upon in any ways in which they were alike. In fact, the further they had gotten from boyhood, the fewer those there had been. Harrier was interested in the things he could see and touch, and the only problems that helped his interest were all the ones he could see a quick solution to. Tersail liked puzzles and problems and mysteries. The more peculiar, the better. He liked solving them, of course. The problems his age mates brought to him could almost always be solved, once he knew all the elements. But the problems he liked best were the ones that didn't really seem to have any solution. Why had the elves gone away, for example? They didn't dislike humans. His schoolmasters taught that the elves had lived among humans for centuries after the defeat of the Endarkened and helped them rebuild everything that the Endarkened had destroyed. In fact, all of the 9 cities were built in places that elves had once had cities. So why had the elves left? No one seemed to really care. It was such a long time ago, after all. Maybe somebody at the university knew. He supposed he could ask the professors once he got there, though what he'd do with the information once he had it, he wasn't exactly sure. "Look," Harrier said excitedly, breaking into his reverie. "I can see the fair, and look! They're setting up the flower wheel. Oh, Ter, it's even taller than last year! We've got to ride that." Tersail gulped and nodded. He hated heights. Several bells later, the two overstuffed and nearly exhausted teenagers wended their way homeward, having spent a glorious day, sampling all the pleasures that the festival fair could offer. Harrier had ridden the flower wheel 3 times, Tersel's once. Once was enough, in Tersel's opinion. And both boys had gorged themselves on highly spiced meat pies and sweet pastries, despite the enormous feast that was to come this evening as part of Harrier's naming day celebration. Harrier had won several fairings of his game of skill. He'd given them to Tersel to present to his sisters. They'd rented skates and taken turn around a small ice rink, and watched several different historical plays, including The Sacrifice of the Blessed Saint Idalia, a favorite of both of theirs, as it had both a darkened and a dragon. And one showing the day when the wild mages and the unicorns came to Kellen, the poor orphan boy, as he stood shivering in the rags in the snow, cast out by his family, and gave him an enchanted sword and told him he was the Night Mage, destined to unite all the armies of the light against the darkness. If a bunch of people came to me and said something like that, Harrier said, I'd laugh in their faces. Then I'd run. No, you wouldn't, Tersel had answered. Not if it was wild mages and unicorns. Harrier hadn't answered. Tersel was right, of course. But Tersel known he wanted to disagree. But now their day of liberty was at end. As they reached the top of the Tersel street, evensong bells had begun to ring out. Oh, light, I'm late! Tersel groaned. Not yet, his friend assured him cheerfully. But you're about to be. Harry watched for a moment as Tersel headed for the Rolfort townhouse at a dead run, cloak and tunic flapping, then turned and made for his own door in no more sedate fashion. And that concludes Chapter 1. Chapter 2. A Naming Day Gift. By the middle of the first night bells, Harry's naming day party was well underway. As befit a party commemorating the 17th naming day of one of the sons of the harbour master of Armathilai, the event was not only well attended by friends and family, but visited by those who wished Antarian Gillian to think well of them over the year to come. Fortunately, those visitors came early and stayed only briefly, and by the time a few chimes had passed, the party was what it ought to be, a celebration held by family and attended by friends. Where will we all be this time next year? Tersel wondered. He was standing in a corner, attempting, so far successfully, to avoid the dancing. Harrier was not so lucky. At the moment he was out in the middle of Gillian's main parlour, converted for the evening to a dancing floor, getting to dance with Tersel's sister, Heavenade, while good Lady Divigana, Harry's mother, looked on indulgently. Tersel knew that there'd once been some talk of a match between the two, but the days of when families did anything but advise their children on whom they should marry were long gone. This was hardly at the time of mages, and Heavenade was barely 14. Next year. The glum mood he had been fighting most successfully since he had woken this morning to the ring of the festival day Carillion returned full force. This was the last year he'd seen much of Harrier at all. Next year, Harrier would be far too busy with his duties as apprentice harbour master to have any time for his old friend. And he? Well, he'd be at university. Papa said you had to study hard there. And after that, oh, maybe someday he'd win one of the coveted city magistrate-ships. Magistrates spent their whole day solving other people's problems. That would be nice. Tersel tried to work up an interest in his future. There you are, Tersel. This is no night to be hiding in corners. Come and dance. Oh, Mama, I don't... Come and dance, his mother said firmly, taking him by the elbow and leading him out from behind the ornamental garland behind which he had been fairly successfully until now, hiding. Ignoring his half-voiced protests, she conducted him out towards the dance floor. They're making up a set, and we don't want to delay them. But just as the dancers were about to begin, he was paired up with Brault's wife, Marone, to his relief. She was a good dancer and would get him through the elaborate figures without disaster. There was a sudden disturbance in the doorway. What? Starting without me? Now I call that rude. Alfred! Divigana cried in delighted surprise. Now, little sister, How could you possibly think I'd miss my little nephew's naming day? After all, he's, what, 8? 9? The eccentrically dressed stranger roared cheerfully, swooping Divigana off her feet and swinging her around as if she weighed nothing at all. 17, Uncle Alfred, Harrier said resignedly, stepping forward. His uncle regarded him in disbelief. Surely I hadn't begun that long, he muttered. Surely you have, his sister said firmly. It was supposed to be only a short trip to the Silken Isles. Ah, but Divvy, once I was there, the stories I heard. There's a land far to the west of the Isles where, so they say, there are people with the skin color of the night sky, and others with wings of birds. They say there's a country where dogs and horses can talk, and people go without any clothes at all, and do exactly what the beasts tell them. They say— And did you see any of that, Alfred? Divigana interrupted, sounding indulgent. Well, no, her brother admitted. But I saw wonders enough. Why, let me tell you about the time our ship got attacked by pirates. And sunk, too. And if not for the great warm-blooded fish that swam up out of the depths and carried me to safe haven, I wouldn't be here to tell you about it. Divigana wrinkled her nose doubtfully. I swear, by the wild magic, it's all true, her brother said virtuously. It carried me to an island where the people used the creatures to herd their livestock, just as we do with dogs. Their sheep must get very wet, Enterins commented disbelievingly. But come, let me get you something to drink. And then you can tell us why you weren't still there. As to that, there were no good books, of course, Alfred said virtuously. And speaking of books, it's a poor guess I'd be if I came all this way and forgot young Harrier's naming day present. I have it right here. He delved deep into one of the enormous pockets of his gaudy traveling cloak and pulled out a gaily wrapped parcel, thrusting it at Harrier and regarding him expectantly. Watching his friend's face, Tersel's heart sank in sympathy. It was obviously a book, and Harrier had little use for books. Tersel's own present to Harrier had been a detailed and elaborate model of a fully rigged Selkin sailing carrel, one that he knew Harrier had been admiring in the model maker's window for moon turns. But Harrier opened it and exclaimed politely over the book, just as if it were something he'd been hoping to receive all year. Tersel craned closer, trying to get a glimpse of the title. It was certainly not a new book. The dusty blue velvet binding was worn to threadbare shiningness with age, and only the fact that the title was composed of metal letters fixed somehow into the cover of the book rendered it legible at all. A compendium of ancient myth and legend, compiled from the histories of the city. But the letters had ever been gilded, the gilding had worn off long ago, and they were now simply black with tarnish and age. You're no better a liar now than you were at 6, Harrier Gillian, his uncle said with fond irritation. You'd rather have a new pair of boots or a fine cloak or whatever shiny new distraction entertains the young this season. But I assure you, there are more wonders to be found in this book than all of Armthalai if you'll only take a moment to look. And isn't this the season above all others where we should contemplate the marvels of the past? Those days when magic and wonders filled the lands and things were never as they seemed? I promise you, the world is wider than your silly little harbor with its silly little ships. Well, without our silly little harbor and its silly little ships, you'd hardly have a place to sail from and back to, wouldn't you, Alfred? Interin said a bit sharply. Is it about magic? Harrier asked doubtfully. That and more, Alfred said grandly. And I look forward to hearing what you think of it, he told his nephew meaningfully. Tersel saw Harrier do his best to repress a sigh. At last, Divigana was able to lead her brother toward the sideboard, filled with good things to eat and drink, helping him off his cloak as she did so. Don't worry, Har, Tersel said. I'll read it for you and tell you what's in it. I'm sure he won't ask too many questions. Harry shot Tersel a grateful look, but in fact as much as curiosity as the friendship that prompted Tersel's offer. The book looked interesting. He probably won't be here long enough to ask any at all, Harrier said with a relieved grin, promptly handing the book to Tersel. Can't even remember the last time Uncle Alfred came back to Armthalai. He's always off traveling somewhere. I've gotten some pretty strange presents over the years, though. Tersel grinned back. He remembered those. Most of them had wound up at the Gillian attic, like a giant stuffed lizard and the musical clock. Some had been pretty baffling, like the set of glass fish that whistled if you put them out in the rain. And some, Harrier's parents never let their youngest child see at all. The party broke up rather later than it might have otherwise have done. For the rest of the evening, Alfred Auvelin had been the center of attention, telling amazing tales of his adventures and dancing with every woman there. Tercel had been fascinated. It wasn't, of course, that he actually wanted to go anywhere. He was perfectly content with his life in Armithili. But he had loved hearing stories of exotic places, and when Rolforts left for the evening, Harrier's naming day present was tucked firmly under Tercel's arm. For the next several days, the compendium of ancient myth and legend languished in Tercel's study unread. This festival was a very busy time of year for everyone in Armithili. For the Rolfort family, there were parties to be present at, shrines to visit, commemorative ceremonies to attend, at the great temple of light and the magistrate's palace, of course. And also Tercel's studies, which could not be neglected even over a festival holiday. He'd only gotten a couple of opportunities to glance at it. It was a very thick book and quite old, but it looked very promising, with pictures of unicorns, other folk, and men in grey robes with very odd hats. He saw little of Harrier during that time because, of course, even if school was not in session, that hardly meant that Harbour Master's son had nothing to do either. Harrier was at the port from second dawn bells till evening song bells, just as good as going to be our apprentice Harbour Master should be. But at last, as Festival Night drew to a close, Tercel finally found the time to fulfill his promise to Harrier. He would treat reading Harrier's book just as if it were a school project, taking notes and writing a report and everything, so that just in case Alfred Auvelin did ask Harrier about his naming day present, Harrier would be able to answer all his questions. It was a damp, dull day. A steady, soaking rain pounded the streets of the city, washing the last of the early spring snow and muting the Carillion so that, if not for the clocks, it would be almost impossible to tell the passing of one bell from the next. Tercel took the compendium off the window seat in the corner of his study and settled down to read. Those days when magic and wonders filled the land and things were never as they seem indeed. The title called the book Myth and Legend, but it almost seemed to be history. Ancient history. Tercel had never really had the opportunity to read a lot of ancient history. There weren't really very many books on that in the general section of the Great Library. Oh, there were traditional tales of the Great Flowering and the Blessed Saint Idalia, but they were so skimpy on details that he just skimmed them. They raised more questions than answered, and nobody seemed to have any answers. Instead, he'd read more books on literature, geography, botany, and even slightly more recent history, the kind that people could actually prove that happened. These are all courses taught in the preparatory school, and all subjects he dabbled in his own time. He'd learned a lot, but it had frustrated him too, because none of them had ever really engaged his interests. At heart, Tercel had begun to wonder if he was nothing more than a dabbler, a dilettante, light-minded. But the compendium, which said at the front that it contained excerpts from something called a History of the City in the 6 volumes, talked about the Time Ages not only in more detail than any book Tercel had ever run across before, but it spoke as if whoever written it had actually been there and understood why those things happened. In that time, all of other folk and other races were banished beyond the bounds of the lands, claimed for the city of Armithili, for the high mages saw them as a rebuke for the power of the high magic. High magic? What was that? Thus, when the king Andorianel of the elves invoked the ancient treaty and called the humans to fight for the light against the Undarkened, then called demons, the high mages refused to fight or allowed their subjects to fight. It was only when they last came to understand that they had been the first victims of the Undarkened in the Third War against the Light. Third War? There had been others? that the High Mages were at last brought to set aside 1,000 years of fear and prejudice and blend their power once more with the Wild Mages and their ancient allies of the Light to defeat the Undarkened. There was more, though not much more, about the Third War. The war that Tercel thought all his life was the only war. The rest of that chapter talked about the High Mages from before the war. And that was fascinating enough. Tercel Rollfort had grown up in the world with magic. Of course, you almost never saw it, but everyone knew it was there. Pretty much like Wild Mages, everyone knew that they were there. But a person can only go their whole life without seeing one, or knowing that they'd seen one at least, because it wasn't like a Wild Mage to announce his or her presence unless it was absolutely vital to the task at hand, and according to the stories, they often swore the people they helped to secrecy. Certainly he'd grown up in a world full of other folk, fauns and centaurs and brownies at least, and Harrier swore that there were merfolk in the ocean, deep down, and selkies on some of the more secluded out-islands, though they hardly counted as magic. Everyone knew that far to the east was the kingdom of the elves, and that even though the elves had no magic, they shared their land with numberless races that did. Unicorns and dryads and dragons, and the Light knew what else. But this was something else entirely. If Tercel was reading this book properly, once, long ago, there'd been another kind of magic besides wild magic. A kind that you'd, learn. The way you'd learn maths or geography or dancing. Something called high magic. And that, not the wild magic, had been what the High Mages who had ruled over the city in the time of mages had practiced. They ruled Amarthalai for thousands of years before the Great Flowering. Knowing that, realizing that, gave Tercel an unsettled feeling, like standing in a room and suddenly realizing that it was just twice as big as he thought it was. Of course he had heard of the time of mages, and of course he had known that the world didn't just start on the day of the Great Flowering. But for the book in his hands to speak so casually of events that took place so many years before that, well, it was fascinating. He wondered if anyone, anywhere, still knew anything at all about the high magic. On his free afternoon, Tercel went down to the Great Library. The library had always been one of his favorite places in the city. First his nurse, then his tutor had brought him here, introducing him to the wonders of the building filled with books on every subject that there was. Though the Great Library had been rebuilt and expanded many times over the centuries, part of it were as old as the city itself. When the new wing had been added a few centuries ago, it had been about the same time that old city walls were being taken down, and several sections of the wall had been incorporated into the new wing, blending old and then the new together. Tercel liked to go into the new wing just to admire the brightly glazed and ornamented stones. The ancient Armethalians must have loved beauty above all things if they surrounded their city with such a highly decorated wall. On most days he wandered aimlessly through the library galleries, seeing what was new, and then visiting the sections that held his favorite subjects. Today, however, he didn't dawdle. He was on a mission. Research. He quickly sought out Master Cancel. Master Cancel was the chief librarian of the Great Library, and ordinarily he would have little time for someone Tercel's age, for Tercel's persistence in seeking out books far beyond those of his years would normally be interested and had long ago piqued Master Cancel's interest, and the two of them, the aged scholar and the young student, had become friends. Master Cancel said often it was a great pity that Tercel was bound for clerkship, for he would have made an excellent librarian, and more than once Tercel had been tempted to agree with him. I'm looking on for some books on history, Master Cancel. Really ancient history, from before the Great Flowering. I'm wondering if you have... Tercel pulled out a scrap of paper out of his pocket and consulted his notes. A copy of something called A History of the City? It's in 6 volumes. It's supposed to be from then. Master Cancel looked puzzled for a moment, then smiled. You're interested in pre-flowering history, Tercel. Have you decided to study at the university? Well, I'm not sure. I think so. but I thought I'd read some of it now to make sure. Master Cancel smiled indulgently. Well, we do have some, of course. There's not much we'd call for the books in the general collection. Let me get you a pass, and we'll go close down the closed shelves. A few minutes later, and his new pass hung securely around his neck, Tercel accompanied Master Cancel into the clothes collection. The rooms were completely dark. This is the old building, Master Cancel said, holding his lantern up high. As you'll take note, there are no windows in here. Scholars believe that in the time of ages, the building was kept lit by cold fire, though no one is quite sure how anyone would waste magic in lighting a building. Methelai was a city of mages, Tercel said. Cancel smiled. I see you've already done quite a bit of researching. Yes, so they say. But it's hard to imagine that wild mages would have been so wasteful. Of course, it certainly is fortunate that they spent so much time in preserving the books. They're in better condition than many published only decades ago. Not wild mages, Tercel thought to himself. High mages. As they entered the main room, Cancel stopped to light several lanterns that hung from the bracket walls. As their flames grew and steadied, they provided enough light to allow Tercel to see the entire room was filled with books. Along one wall, directly under the lanterns, were several small desks. When the scholars from the university came here to do research, of course we light more of the lamps, Cancel said. But this should be enough light for you to find a few books to read. Come, let's see if we can find that history for you. A moon turn and a half later, kindling had given way to true spring. As Tercel exited the great Temple of the Light, one light day morning, he was surprised to see Harrier waiting for him at the foot of the steps. There were many temples to the light of Armethalai. The Gillians attended Light Day, one near the pier, where the main Light Day service was held much earlier than the great temple at the center of the city. Harrier had already obviously been gone to the Light Day litany. He had changed from Light Day best back into his everyday clothes. Tyr! He cried as he spotted Tercel, standing with his family in the press of the crowd. Harrier shouldered his way through the press of Light Day worshippers clustered in front of the temple steps, and, obviously too excited to make his polite greetings to Tercel's parents and sisters, began talking at once. A ship came in, late last night, and they swear it was attacked by a kraken. Come and see! Lord Rolfort cleared his throat meaningfully, and Harrier flushed at his own rudeness, hastily greeting Lord and Lady Rolfort and Tercel's 4 younger sisters, who giggled at his discomfiture, until Lady Rolfort regarded him sternly in turn. I'll come, Tercel said hastily. In a bell, or 2. Chime, less than 2 bells later, Tercel arrived at the port. It didn't matter that this was Light Day, the business of the port must go on. Ships could not be asked to stand out in the harbor and wait until the next day to dock, after all, so he was not in the least surprised to see Harrier waiting for him at the portmaster's office. So, he said, sticking his head into the doorway. About the ship? Harry looked up from the table in the doorway. He pushed his russet hair out of his eyes and grinned. The Murray-Kate limped into the harbor just after watch bells this morning, swearing absolutely that she'd been attacked by a kraken. And everybody knows that there aren't any kraken, but something tore up her hull. Dal had to send them over to dry dock before they sank in the slip. Come see! Harrier came to join him, and the two of them began to walk down the dock. No kraken, Tercel said lightly. You might as well say there are no unicorns, though I grant neither of us is ever going to see one. But there certainly are kraken. At least, there used to be, before the Great Flowering, although since there aren't any creatures of the Undarkened, I admit there probably aren't any now. Been reading an Uncle Alfred's book, have you? Harrier asked with a grin. Ask me anything. Or, did you know that there used to be another kind of magic besides wild magic? A kind you don't have to be born with, or called to by the gods of the wild magic? A kind almost anybody can learn? They called it high magic. There are books about it in the library. They used to call Amarethlian the Mage City. Harrier regarded him with a combination of exasperation and disbelief. Is that why you've been spending so much time down at the Great Library these days? I thought you were just studying for your entrance exam for the university. Oh, I'm doing that too. But the books I want to read are delicate, and Master Cancel let me borrow some of them, but he won't let me borrow the ones I want to read now. Still, I had to pick a subject to study at school. I might as well pick ancient history. Because it doesn't really matter? Harrier asked. Unfortunately, that was a little too close to the truth. One subject is as good as another, Tersel answered lightly. By now they'd reached the area of the docks where the ships that had needed more extensive work than there could be done on them, while they stood at anchor, were brought. When a hull needed to be scrapped clean of gross or otherwise repaired, the ship was brought to dry dock, where even the largest hull could be lifted free from the water to be worked on. There were several ships here at the moment, but it was obvious which was the Marquette. Her hull was still damp. And it was obviously Port Master Gillian had been in such a hurry to get her to dry dock, even to someone like Tersel. Her hull looked like it had been clawed. There were long white scars in the dark salt-seasoned oak. Deep ones too, running nearly the length of the ship. Could be anything, Harrier said dismissively, startling Tersel. He thought the gouges in the hull were pretty impressive. Rocks, even whales. Why would the captain say it was a kraken? Harrier grinned. If the bondholders can prove the shipmasters was negligent, they don't have to pay off the damage. And running your ship up on the shoal, or a pond of whales, counts as negligent seacraft under bond. But a kraken is the same as a storm, so the bond would have to pay off then. So, who's going to win? Tersel asked, blinking slowly. The bondsman or the shipmaster? Harrier shrugged. Probably the bondsman. He stepped up into the timber bulks, holding the ship upright and pulling out his belt knife. The ship has been badly maintained. See how soft the timber is? He set his knife to the hull beside one of the gashes, and without any great difficulty carved away a long splinter of wood. I shouldn't be able to do that, he explained for Tersel's benefit. He stepped onto the dock again and handed the splinter to Tersel. Tersel examined it. The wood was soft. And it doesn't look like any rock or whale damage I've ever seen, Harrier said reluctantly. But all the bondsman will care about is that the Marquis is a sloppy ship whose master had probably been sailing close to the wind for a long time. So he's not likely to believe in kraken. Harrier shrugged, taking a last look over his shoulder at the ship. It's strange, though. The captain said he was just beyond the farthest of the out islands when it had happened. Couldn't have been much further out, or they'd never made it to port with their hull racked up the way it was. And there just aren't any reefs out there that could do that to the ship. But there aren't any kraken. Second night bells had just rung and the entire Wolfort family was safe in their beds. Except Tersel. He was in his bedroom, true, but not in bed. A scrap of wood Harrier had carved from the hull of the Marquette sat beside his table, on top of the journal in which Tersel had been taking to keep his notes on the high magic. Tomorrow the bondsman would meet with the ship's master at the port to look over the damage and decide what part, if any, of the repairs would be paid out for of the bond. It didn't seem fair that the man should lose his ship. Harrier had said that was probably what would happen if the bond wasn't paid. The ship would be sold up, probably as scrap timber, and Marquette's captain would have to go to work as a hired master on a ship he didn't own. Not the worst fate in the world, but it would be better if there was some way to prove he was telling the truth about there being something out there that had grabbed his ship. Tersel wondered if there was anything he could do to help. Maybe there was. There were a lot of spells in the high magic. Tersel had been stunned to discover, once he'd really started digging through the books in the closed collection in the Great Library, that instead of being lost or even locked up, everything he wanted to know about high magic was right there on the shelves, mixed in with the histories. Spellbooks and manuals, practical information, nearly everything he needed to know. It hadn't seemed right somehow to just play around with it for fun, though. So even though he'd copied out several of the simplest spells, high magic seemed to be very elaborate and complicated, he'd never actually tried to do any of it. But this would be for a good cause. There was a spell called Knowing. It didn't seem to be very complicated and didn't require all of the elaborate tools that some of the other spells did. Just some wine and candles and some light incense and a few incantations. There were some other things about shielding and fasting and ritual hours and proper preparation, but he didn't really understand them, and they looked like things he could afford to skip. Besides, Mama would certainly notice if he tried to skip meals. The description of knowing said that you would understand an object in its entirety once you cast a spell upon it. If he cast knowing on the piece of the hull of the Maricate, well, then wouldn't he know how it came to be damaged? And then he could go and tell Portmaster Gillian what he had learned. Assuming the high magic was actually real and the spell worked. Even Tercel had admitted it sounded like a lot of ifs and assumptions. When he was certain that everyone had settled in for the night, Tercel made his way down to the the household light shrine, and removed a small handful of the light incense from its silver box. He also took one of the charcoal cakes to burn it on. Folding both items carefully into a handkerchief, he went from there to the kitchen and took 5 candles from the candle box. That should be enough. The spell just said candles, and he wasn't sure how many to use. Most of the spell he'd seen seemed to do things in multiples of 4, though, so he figured 4 should be enough, and 1 for the center. He went back to his room and made the rest of his preparations. He rolled away the rug in the center of the floor, and used a piece of blackboard chalk from his study to carefully draw a symbol he had copied out in one of the old books into the middle of the floor. Next, he placed 4 candles at the corners of the middle, and 1 in the middle, and set the piece of wood from the Maricate next to the middle candle. Then he'd realized he'd forgotten something to burn the incense in. A quick scavenger hunt through his study turned up an old pottery bowl. It was thick and heavy, a souvenir from the flowering fair a few years back. He used it to hold spare pen points and to hold his own papers when the windows were open. It would certainly do. He emptied it out, rubbed it clean with a sleeve, and carried it back into the bedroom, setting it down in the middle of the chalk diagram. There. Everything was ready. Tercel admitted he'd never felt sillier in his life. He was much too old for games of let's pretend. And deep in his heart he was sure that that was all this could possibly be. Certainly he believed that the high magic had worked once, centuries and centuries ago, but he also believed that if it still worked, people would still be using it. After all, wouldn't everyone want to be a mage if they had the chance? Still, he was committed to trying, so he sat down cross-legged beside the diagram and opened his notebook and carefully read out the spells for knowing, slowly sounding out the unfamiliar symbols and making strange gestures that had been depicted in the books. He knew he was supposed to have a wand for that, but doing the spell had been pretty much spur-of-the-moment idea, so maybe it wouldn't matter. He finished. Nothing happened. Well, what did you expect? Tercel thought, feeling more than a little embarrassed. Even though he hadn't expected anything to happen, he had hoped, more than wanted to admit, even to himself, that something would. The time of mages is definitely over. Just then he started to feel sick. The room seemed to be getting darker. The year before he met Harrier, Tercel had been so sick that the healers of Mermethlai, the best of the 9 cities, had told his parents that his only hope for survival lay in the wild mage. In those days, even Heavenade hadn't been born yet. He'd been the Lord and Lady Rolorf's only child, and to save his life, they'd taken him immediately to the Temple of the Light in Centaur Shadeen, hoping against hope that a wild mage could be found to heal him. Fortunately, one was there, waiting for them, in fact, and Tercel had quickly been restored to health. He'd remembered nothing of it at all of his illness. Supposedly he'd never remember anything much about being a child, though Tercel did. But he'd always remembered the strange dreams he had had while being ill, even though it happened so very long ago. They'd been vividly real, yet impossible. He'd known that even then. And now, after so many years, he was having another one without even falling asleep. He was looking at a lake of fire. Instead of being blue like a proper lake, it was orange. The air above it shimmered with heat, and its entire surface danced with flames, as if somebody had taken an ordinary, homely hearth fire and just made a huge pool of it somehow. It was almost pretty. And standing in the middle of it was a woman. I was wrong, because if it was fire, she wouldn't be able to stand on it, but she was. And she was utterly naked, though he tried very hard. Tercel couldn't look away, and he couldn't wake up. He'd seen statues of naked women in museums, and he tried to tell himself that it's all it was, but her long hair had moved to the heat of the flames below her, and the fire gleamed off her skin, so that he couldn't really tell what color it was. Somehow she saw him watching her, and when she did, she raised her arms and held them out to him, beckoning to him. He had to go with her. Tercel knew he did, but as that excited, ashamed, half-formed thought worked its way to the front of his mind, it was met by another reaction equally strong. Terror. No. More than terror. Revulsion. Because there was something horrible about the fire women, something he could sense but couldn't see, and the fact that he didn't quite know what it was made it even more frightening, even though this was only a dream and the things that frightened you or didn't in dreams weren't the same as the ones that scared you when you were awake. She was beautiful, but the longer Tercel looked at her, the stronger his desire to run away became, because he knew that if he stayed here one moment more, something terrible would happen. Only he didn't know what that was, and he didn't know how to get away. Fire! Hedmon's shout jarred Tercel out of the not dream. The footman was pounding desperately on his locked door. He took a deep breath and began to cough wildly. Everything in his room was on fire, and the room was rapidly filling with smoke. His bed, the curtains, even the rug he pushed to one side, all were sheets in flame. With a yelp of dismay, he snatched up his workbook and ran to unbolt his door. Fortunately, the area between the glyph and the door didn't contain anything that could readily burn. Hedmon took one step over the threshold, stared, and yanked Tercel out of his room, shouting for servants and water buckets. Fortunately, though everything in Tercel's bedroom that could possibly had caught on fire, the fire hadn't had time to take a really good hold before it had been discovered. By the time Fire Watch had arrived in Rolford's townhouse, the flames had already been extinguished. "Do you have any idea what caused the fire, Lord Rolford?" the fire warden asked. The family and most of the servants had gathered in the main parlor. It was after midnight bells. The room was chill, since the fire had been baked for night 2 bells ago, and now every window in the place had been open to air the house of the lingering scent of smoke. "Candles," Rolford answered, with a look of Tercel that was both irritated and disappointed. "My eldest decided to try reading in bed by candlelight. Light knows why. He fell asleep. It won't happen again." "Beds are for sleeping, chairs are for reading," the fire warden said firmly, as if reciting a watchword. "If more people would remember that, there'd be fewer home incidents." He glanced at Tercel and frowned. "Your boy doesn't look well at all, if you don't mind me saying so, Lord Wolford." In fact, Tercel didn't feel well at all either. Once the initial terror and excitement of the fire had worn off, he realized he felt feverish and exhausted. The clothes he'd been wearing when he did the spell were soaked in sweat, as if Hedmon had been pouring water on him, not the flames. And despite that, he couldn't keep his teeth from chattering. In fact, he could barely keep his eyes open. It was that, and not any lie he'd told, that had led his father to say what he had to the fire warden. Hedmon had seen the candles in the room as he dragged him out, but the old footman had been too rattled to quite say quite where they'd been, and they were gone now in any event, consumed by the flames. Tercel felt guilty as much as he felt anything other than weary, but he thought it would be just as well to let the misunderstanding stand. He really didn't want to explain to his parents that he'd been doing magic up in his room tonight, especially when the spell hadn't worked. Only it had. He just hadn't cast the spell he'd been meaning to. "Fire is the first and simplest spell of high magic," it had said over and over in all the books and the high magic he'd read. He cast fire. And maybe the woman in the lake of fire were just a hallucination, and it wouldn't happen again. To Tercel's great relief, and the rest of the night, what there was of it, was unencumbered by dreams of any kind. But when he finally awoke, it was nearly first afternoon bells, and he'd slept long past the time the ship's bondman would meet the captain of the Mermaid. He felt far too giddy and lightheaded to even get out of bed anyway. Not that it would have done me any good if I had been there, he thought ruefully. He'd wanted to help, but all he had done last night was nearly set the entire townhouse on fire. He hadn't learned a single thing that would account one way or another for the injuries at the Marquette's Hall, and now it was too late for it to matter. He was truly sorry for that, because it was very likely the captain would lose his ship, as Harrier said, and it was unlikely he'd run into some rocks if it had been wrecked where he said it had. Still, there was nothing Tercel could do. But someday there will be. It wasn't fair for it to be one man's word against another's in a situation like this, with the both of them having something to gain from being right. Someone should investigate who has nothing to gain. If I am ever a magistrate, I promise I will make sure that is always what happens. Someone should care about the truth, and only the truth. That evening, Tercel received a stern lecture from his father about his carelessness with candles. He apologized sincerely. He truly hadn't meant to set anything on fire, no matter how he'd done it, and promised truthfully never to light another candle in his rooms. He certainly learned his lesson. High magic belonged in books and in the past. He never intended to try to cast another spell. He hated to deceive his parents, even by accident and omission, but he simply felt too embarrassed and ashamed to admit that what he'd really been doing in the room caught on fire. Besides, he had been reading, sort of, just not in bed. And if he'd said that the room caught on fire because he'd cast a spell, not trying to cast a spell, but actually casting a spell, and not because one of the candles fell over and rolled, they wouldn't believe him anyway. He hadn't quite believed him, and he didn't quite believe him, and he'd been there. Better to leave matters the way they were. So he apologized sincerely and promised to do better, and Mama dosed him with strengthening cordials and kept him home from preparatory school the next day too, and on the whole, Tercel was great to get off as lightly as he had. Only he hadn't. It was almost a se'night later, and Tercel had done his best to forget the whole frightening and humiliating incident. It was the first night since the fire he wasn't sleeping in a trundled bed in his study, because the repairs of his bedroom were finally complete. The fire-damaged room had been scrubbed to within an inch of its life and completely repainted, but even with new curtains, new rug, new bedding, it still faintly smelled of smoke and scorch. It looked very bare. All the odds and ends that used to clutter it up were gone, lost in the fire, and most of his clothes were still in the fullers and tailors, being cleaned up and repaired. Now Harrier would never have to make his report of his naming day gift, though he would have to confess to loaning it to a friend. Hardly a major transgression, really, because the compendium was one of the many things that had been lost in the blaze. Tercel promised himself that he'd buy Harrier a replacement gift, and something that Harrier would probably like better. He lay on his back at the center of his bed. It was a new mattress, and it felt strange. I was certain he'd never managed to fall asleep in his room, turned strange and new. But he did, and suddenly he was back on the shore of the lake of fire again. Only this time it was far more real than it had been in his last vision. This time he could feel the heat of the wind on his skin, he could feel the breeze blowing through his hair, smell the scents of burnt rock and sulfur, hear the pop and hiss of the burning lake, felt the itch in his eyes as the hot wind dried them. And most of all, he wasn't him. "Welcome," he heard. "I had nearly given up hope that you would come. Are you ready to at last accept the gifts I have for you?" It was as if when she spoke he could suddenly see her, although Tercel knew she'd been there all along. The firewoman from his vision, now dream, the one who was horrifying and terrifying, though she only looked beautiful. The one he wanted to go to, even though the thought revolted him. She was calling to him, just as she had in the vision. But it wasn't him. And he knew, if whoever she was calling went to her, or she noticed that Tercel was there too, and could see her, something really terrible was going to happen. Suddenly her gaze sharpened, and Tercel realized she had noticed he was there, or at least something was. In another moment she might see him. He awoke with a strangled yell, shaking with utter panic. For a moment he was convinced that the firewoman was right there in his room with him, and was half out of the bed before he was able to stop himself. But no, he was alone in his bedroom. She might not be here, but she's real. He had no idea why he was so convinced of that. A dream. It was only a dream. He tried to convince himself that, but he couldn't. Tersel had never been very good at lying to himself. This was something unlike anything he'd ever imagined to be possible, at least possible now in the modern world, but he believed it, and that frightened him even more. Things like the firewoman belonged to the time of mages. He knew she wasn't human, but he didn't even know what kind of other folk she might be. All that he knew was that if she got what she wanted, something terrible was going to happen. Fortunately, he didn't know what it was. It was like starting a book in the middle. What he did know was that all of a sudden, magic wasn't something safely locked away in history books, or safely in the hands of the temple and wild mages. It was right here, stalking him, and he didn't have the faintest idea of what to do about it. Eventually, Tersel calmed down enough to light his bedside lamp, and even managed to talk himself into getting out of bed and opening his curtains. A cheerful, familiar light from the street calmed him further, pushing the images from the dream farther away. He lit more lamps and then got up to read in his study until dawn. It was hard to concentrate on his schoolwork that day, both because of having missed most of a night's sleep, and because every time he closed his eyes, Tersel saw the face of a firewoman. Even in broad daylight in the middle of his familiar classroom, with a sense of a cool spring day coming through the open windows, the images of his dream were still vivid in his mind. She was as bright as fire. She ought to have been exotic and beautiful. He shifted uncomfortably, arousing, and said she made him think of all the frightening and ugly things in life. There really hadn't been a lot. But once he and Harrier snuck to the docks to see if the fishermen bring in one of their own who had drowned. The man had been laid out on the wharf beside the boat that had brought him in, bloated and tattered and white. And as the two of them had stood gaping at the edge of the crowd, the dead man's slack lips had begun to twitch and work, and several small black crabs had crawled out of his mouth. Tersel had thrown up most of the way home. The firewoman made him feel worse. Part of him wondered if he was going to dream about her every night for the rest of his life. If he was, what was he going to do about it? He couldn't sleep if he did. He couldn't go without sleep. And there was worse. Last night he had been convinced that his dream was real. In daylight he wasn't so sure. But what if it was? What if it was and happening now? Shouldn't he do something about it? Tell someone? After his classes were over for the day, he went down to the port. He found Harrier there with a sheaf of papers in hand, going over something with the shipmaster. This was one of Harrier's jobs, and Harrier was working, so Tersel patiently waited until he was through. At last, Harrier handed over the papers to the ship's master, received a scroll in return, and turned to go. "Tersel," Harrier said in surprise. Tersel got to his feet. He had been sitting on a large coil of rope, waiting for Harrier to finish. "I've got to talk to you." "Now? I'm here for 2 more bells, and I have half a dozen ships to check in. It's important. I'll have to be quick. Come over here to the storage shed. It's out of the wind." When they were safely inside the shed, Harrier leaned against the door and folded his arms. "Now, what's so urgent?" "You know the day you showed me the Murricate?" Harrier frowned and his brow cleared. "Oh, aye. Dad took a skiff out to the outset with the captain so he could show him where she'd been hulled. Nothing there, at least not rocks. Bondsman didn't pay full damage, but he did pay a bit, and Seaman's assurance will loan the rest. He'll have some lean years while he pays back the loan, but he won't lose his ship. Hit some flowing wreckage more likely. Was that what you wanted to know?" At least the captain wouldn't lose his ship. Tersel felt better for hearing that. "No. That night, I wanted to help. So I did a spell of the high magic. I'd found it in a book, you see, and it should have told me how the ship was damaged. I thought it would help." Harrier was staring at him if he'd completely lost his mind. "This is what you came to tell me?" Tersel took a deep breath. "Yes, because the spell went wrong. It didn't show me that. It showed me a vision of a lake of fire and a woman. was horrible, and I can't stop seeing them, and I don't know what to do about it. There was a long silence. Your mother said you'd been sick after you set your room on fire, Harrier finally said. Yes, because... Well, you see, I think I cast a fire spell, because the books on the high magic say that... Stop. Tear. Come on. Good joke, but I'm busy. You didn't cast a spell, you're not a wild mage. You aren't listening. I said I used the high magic, and you also told me that the high magic was over and done with about 1,000,000 years ago. So why would it work now? And even if it did, how could you use it? No, you fell asleep and you had a bad dream. End of story. But I'm still seeing her! So you're still having bad dreams, Harrier said patiently. He shrugged, the gesture saying more clearly than words that while he was sorry about the problem, he was certain it was going to go away. And he really didn't see what the fuss was all about. Har, you know that doesn't make any sense. If the high magic used to work, then it still works, and I did something. I know I did. Damned right you did. You set your house on fire. Tyr, if you were a wild mage, you would have the 3 books. Everyone knows that. And I keep telling you, it's not the wild mage, it's high magic. Something anyone can learn if they want to. He knew he was dangerously close to arguing with Harrier, and from the look on Harrier's face, Harrier would be happy to make this into an argument. Harrier didn't want to hear anything he was saying. It was just too unbelievable. When he tried to push Harrier into a direction that he didn't want to go, he got angry. It wouldn't solve anything at all. Okay, Tercel said, raising his hands. I'm sorry I bothered you. I guess I really was still worried about the Margate. And maybe the dreams will stop. Sure they will, Harrier said, relaxing. You just spent too much time on Uncle Erfrin's book, and I have to say I'm not at all sorry to see that go. And everyone comes down with odd fevers when the seasons change. Look, I've got to run. I'll see you soon though, right? Alright, Tercel said. But he didn't see Harrier soon. He knew that if he did, all that would happen was that they'd just have an argument that they barely managed to avoid, and the very last thing he wanted to do was argue with Harrier. Harrier couldn't see things his way, and he couldn't manage to see them any other way. He'd have to solve this problem himself. But by a moon turn later, Tercel was at his wit's end. The dream hadn't gone away, and he'd done everything he could think of to stop. First he'd spoke with his tutor at school about his strange dreams, leaving out the part of casting a spell and high magic, of course, but including every other detail. His tutor simply thought he was working too hard at preparing to enter university this fall, and assured him confidently that there was absolutely no doubt at all that he would get in, even if he didn't attend another class from here until the end of the term. His marks were excellent and always had been. He had nothing to worry about, and now that he'd chosen ancient history as his field of study, all he really had to do was show up at university at the beginning of term and start his classes. No help there. Tercel knew perfectly well that he wasn't having these dreams because he was worried about university. Next, he went to his spiritual preceptor at the Temple of Light and told him everything, absolutely everything, including that he had cast a spell of high magic and that all his troubles had started after that. He'd been sure everything would be fixed then, but to his horror, his preceptor also dismissed his dreams as the sort of dreams a boy your age often has. No matter how long and hard Tercel argued with him, he could not convince the man otherwise. In Preceptor Maver's mind, Tercel's problems could not have to do anything with high magic because high magic simply didn't work. Hadn't for hundreds of years. And if it hadn't worked for four hundreds of years, it couldn't be a problem now, could it? Tercel would have liked to have lit a candle with magic to prove to Preceptor Maver that it did work, but Tercel actually had no idea how he'd done it in the first time. And he had absolutely no intention of fooling around with magic ever again. By then, his lack of sleep, because he had slept as little as possible, was visibly taking its toll, and his mother had taken him back to the healers again. He told the healer, perfectly honestly, that his problem had been nightmares so bad that he was afraid to sleep, and the healer gave him strong sweet cordial that she said would allow him to sleep without dreams. She was right. But he could only take it for a set night, And after that, the nightmare was back, more frequent and vivid than ever. It was always the same one, and he took comfort that he could come from the fact that while it was undoubtedly real, whatever that meant when you were dealing with magic, it was also symbolic. He'd learned a lot more about symbolic dreams in the past few nights, too, since he had spent every free moment he had in the closed archives of the Great Library, reading through everything they had on high magic. He was hoping to find out what his dreams meant and how to cure them, but instead all he found out was what an idiot he had been. Protective shields, for examples. He should have had them up around any place he was working, if he actually meant to do magic. He should have drawn glyphs of protection before he cast a spell, too, and knowing was a student-apprentice spell, not an apprentice spell as he had thought. Far beyond his capability, even though he actually had capability. Even if he had an actual capability. You needed to study for years to become a high mage. The Mageborn had begun their training at the age of 8. Mageborn. Another thing he'd apparently been wrong about was the high magic being a magic that everyone could learn. It was true that more people could learn it than could be wild mages, but apparently you still had to be born with a mysterious something called mage gift. And if you didn't have it, you could study the high magic forever and not be able to cast a single spell. Still, apparently many more people had been high mages in the old days than there were wild mages now. And certainly the training was long and hard, but so was the training to be a healer, or a ship's pilot, or an architect, or even a blacksmith. So why weren't there any high mages anymore? Had people stopped being born with this mage gift? Was there some other reason? Unfortunately, Tercel knew just enough by now how much he didn't know, because although there was an enormous number of pre-flowering books, the closed archives, and in the past moon turn he had, with his teacher's approval, cut a lot of his classes to spend most of his time down there reading them. Comparatively few of them dealt directly with the high magic, and a lot of those assumed you would already knew about the high magic to begin with. Many of them referred to books that the archives didn't have. The more he read, the more he seemed to Tercel that a lot of the high magic hadn't been taught directly mage to mage. And that meant, as far as he could tell, that he really was in trouble now. Because if he really had cast that fire spell, he had the mage gift. And not only were there no high mages left to teach him, but the one thing the surviving books were all very clear on: the awakening mage gift had to be taught, or else the new Mageborn died. And that's where we're gonna cut it off for today. We'll begin next time on Chapter 3, the beginning of the quest. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye!